University, Department of Soil and Crop Sciences. And this is an area that Joe works very closely in, and I know you will learn quite a bit from him. So Joe, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you. And thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me all right? It's coming through good? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to be with everyone tonight. It's getting us a little bit strange when you can't really see your audience and interact with the audience, but we'll do the best we can talking to the computer here. Karen and I had met late last fall, and we've been talking about doing some workshops and some field days and things on pasture management. And we didn't foresee the future very well, I guess, and the virus came along and kind of changed our plans. But we decided it would be good to try to have something this year, so we came up with this webinar idea. And when I started putting this together in the last few days, it's like I think I kind of bit off a little more than I could chew. And so we're going to be covering a lot of different topics, and I'm sure there's going to be questions out there. We'll try to, again, it's a really nasty year out there with the low precip and the way the pastures look, but we'll try to answer some of your questions, and I'll try to take about an hour for the presentation, maybe just a little longer, and then we'll save that last half hour or so for questions. So any of you that own, the smaller acreages, and you've gone out there and bought this property, and a lot of you, when you do that, you have this dream of having some type of livestock, and it can be horses or cows, sheep, goats, llamas, alpacas, chickens, a lot of different types of livestock that people deal with on their small acreages. And you have this big dream of, raising this livestock and taking care of it and feeding it, and pasture is a big part of that. So we all kind of aspire to this scene in this picture here, nice, lush, thick, green growing grass, animals out there, grazing, enjoying themselves, meeting their nutritional needs, those types of things. But especially this year, I just went out the other day and took a drive and took some photos, and this is one of the photos I came up with. And unfortunately, a lot of the pastures are looking kind of like this year. Dry, brown, overgrazed, little growth, no regrowth, basically not enough forage to feed your livestock. In this photo here, kind of in that front part there, just across the fence, you can start to see a few weeds starting to come up and encroach. And this one is grazed pretty tight here, and so if we get some winds and things, we might actually see some soil movement, some soil erosion. So a lot of kind of bad things can happen, especially when we get into these dry situations like we are this year. So just kind of a introductory question here. What's the #1 factor limiting plant growth along the Front Range of Colorado? And this is not a trick question. Surprise, surprise, it's water. Okay. We'll talk about fertility very briefly later on in the presentation, but when we think about, we live in a semi-arid environment, and water is almost always the #1 limiting factor when it comes to plant growth in our area. So when I teach a class in the fall, it's an online class for graduate students dealing with kind of range and forage and pasture management, and I have them do these management plans. And as part of those management plans, one of the first things I have them do is what's the climatic variables in the area of your ranch or your pasture, your property. And I encourage all of you to do this. I've kind of done some here. I pulled up 3 different weather stations, local weather stations. The Fort Collins, one out kind of northeast a little bit around Nunn, and then over at Greeley. So if you look down there at the bottom, that's the total average annual precipitation, and this is over a 30-plus year period. You can see how it varies from one location to the next. Almost 15 inches right here in Fort Collins as we kind of butt up against the foothills. As you move a little further east, you get into that rain shadow of the mountains. Nunn's a little bit less, a little over 13 inches. And then over at Greeley, they're right around 12 inches. Now, when we live in a semi-arid environment, a difference of 3 inches of precip on an annual basis can make a huge difference for plant growth, productivity, and those types of things. So total annual is very important to look at, but it's also important to look at the distribution of that precipitation on a monthly basis. So you can kind of see here that when we get into that April time period, especially here in Fort Collins, we're up over 2 inches on average per month. About 2.5. May is about our highest at about 2.5 inches, and then it kind of just tapers off through the rest of the season. But if we look at that and kind of figure up the growing season precipitation, which is really kind of from about mid-April here to about mid-October, I just totaled up the April through September as the growing season average. About 75% of the total precipitation falls during the growing season. So that's important, again, for plant growth. And this is something I want you to kind of keep in mind when we get into some of the later topics of discussion, especially this distribution. Now, again, this is the average or the normal. And as we all know, in climatic, environmental variables, there's no such thing as normal or average. And, you know, some years we may get 4 inches in a month, and we may only get 1 inch or 1/2 inch in other years. So, and that's kind of what we're seeing this year. So be highly erratic. Yeah, before we kind of get into like the grazing management and some of the other topics, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of just grasses, how grasses grow, how they develop, and some of the things that we should consider when we have animals out there grazing on these grasses. Because grass in a pasture is going to provide the bulk, the dominant dry matter production for your animals. You know, we can have alfalfas, and there can be forbs and broadleaf type plants out there that can provide some forage, but grasses by and far are going to dominate what's produced out there. So here's just kind of a simple diagram showing how a plant develops over time. So in the spring, you'll have some old tillers, and we're talking about perennial grasses, some old tillers from the year before. And then at the base of those, you're going to have some new tillers start to come up. Okay, so you might have some old brown standing dead out there. Then those new tillers will start to come up down there at that base. One of the big things is we're below the growing point, or the main where cell division and things on the plant occur is below the soil surface. So during the early spring, when that first growth, what the grass plant is producing is all leaf material. And that growing point where those cells divide is protected below the soil surface from grazing. It's protected from, you know, freezing temperatures. It's protected from trampling by your animals and all those kinds of things. So those grasses can be grazed. If it's all just leaf material, those grasses can be grazed. And as long as you have soil moisture, those grasses are going to continue to just pump out leaf material in that spring time period. And that can go on for a period of maybe 4 to upwards of 6 weeks during that spring time period, especially for our cool season grasses that I'll talk about here in a little bit. Then at some point, that growing point is going to start to elevate above the soil surface. And at that point, it is susceptible to grazing by the animals, insect damage. Anything that damages that and stops that cell division means that that particular grass tiller is done growing. And then you have to have new buds initiate down below the soil surface. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. And it produces another new tiller, okay? And that takes time. And so if nothing happens to that growing point, you'll continue to get stem production and leaves coming off the sides of those stems. And then eventually, as that plant matures, we get out there and it'll actually produce a seed head and set mature seed if nothing happens to it and that plant is not grazed or harvested in some fashion. So periodically, it's a good idea to let plants seed, set mature seed, say every 3 to 4 years. And so we'll talk about rotational grazing here in a little bit. And that's one advantage of rotational grazing, is that at least part of your pasture area can potentially go to seed every year. And you rotate that around from one year to the next, what part of the pasture goes to seed. That allows the plants to, you know, photosynthesize and produce sugars and put down carbohydrate storage that's important for them as far as their vigor and longevity. Now, this is one of the most important parts of the plant, the grass plant, in my opinion, is what we call that crown region. So the crown is kind of from where the roots join those, what becomes that top growth, or those tillers or shoots, okay? And part of that crown can be below the soil surface. And then what's important is that top, what extends 3 to 4 inches above the soil surface. Now, when I was in school, we used to talk about the root systems all the time. And this is where the carbohydrates were stored and what made the plant resilient and all those kinds of things. But what we found since over time is that it's really those, in that crown region, those stem bases is where we have a lot of carbohydrate storage. And that's important for, once a plant is grazed, to have energy so it can initiate new tillers, new leaves, for overwintering, because the plants are going to survive over winter. They're going to respire over that winter time period and use some of those carbohydrates. And then there's proteins and other things that are stored in that crown region as well. So that's to me, the important part of the plant, because that's where all the new growth occurs, and that's where the main carbohydrate storage and protein storage is in the plant to help it survive over time. And when we look at grasses, we classify them a number of different ways. And one is based on kind of their growth form and how those tillers are arranged coming off of that crown region. So bunch grasses is just kind of, as that name implies, they grow in a bunch, a very tight, compact bunch. And there can be, especially in older grass plants, there can be hundreds of individual grass tillers coming off of that, that crown region. And again, creates this big old nice bunchy of leaves there. And that's what your animals are going to graze on. And then again, eventually you're going to produce goes into that joining or transition phase and produces that stem and that seed head later on as that plant starts to mature. So there's just 3 different grasses that work fairly well in dryland situations. Russian wild rye, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Crested wheatgrass is another one. And then basin wild rye is a native plant that you can find growing throughout Colorado and throughout the western United States. And the other 2 classifications that we look at are based on what we call these specialized stems. A lot of you are familiar with strawberries, and a lot of people call them runners on a strawberry, but they're actually what we call a stolon. And basically that's an above ground horizontal stem. And that runner shoots out, and then it's going to have a little kind of inflamed, swollen node on it. When that node comes in contact with the soil surface, it will put down new roots and put up new leaves at that little node. And grasses have the same thing. Not a lot of grasses have stolons, but there's a lot of grasses that have what are called rhizomes. And a rhizome is the same thing as a stolon, except it's underground. And again, this is a form of vegetative reproduction or vegetative spread on a lot of these grasses. And this really helps to hold the soil, soil stabilization, helps the plant to spread. You don't have to put down seed all the time. They will just continue to spread outward. If you get one plant started, it'll just spread outward from that plant. Especially in wet environments, some of these plants can spread, 2 to 3 feet a year, just based on these rhizomes or stolons. Here's some rhizomatous grasses. Smooth brome is going to be one of the big ones here in kind of Laramie County along the Front Range. Intermediate wheatgrass is another one we plant a lot of times for dryland pastures. Western wheatgrass is a native rhizomatous grass. Find out here on the Eastern Plains, throughout a lot of the Western U.S. And then switchgrass is actually a warm season grass that we'll talk a little more about here in just a little bit. But again, it's will grow more during that hot part of the summer time period. As far as stoloniferous grasses, there's not a lot of those. Bermuda grass is one that we grow in the southeast U.S., but the one that we'll find out here is called buffalo grass. Again, another native species, grows out here on the Eastern Plains along with blue grama, kind of a little short type grass. A lot of people are using this in their lawns now for kind of a low maintenance, low water use type of lawn. But again, you can see the bottom photo there, again, of those stolons. again, and those little nodes on there where they're going to have some roots coming off and new leaves as well. So again, the bunch or the based on the growth form, the bunch grasses or what we call the sod forming grasses, which would be the stoloniferous and the rhizomatous type grasses. Again, a good example of a rhizomatous type grass is the bluegrass in most of our lawns here. That's a rhizomatous sod forming grass. And so again, makes that nice tight turf when we water it. So the other way we classify grasses is what we call cool season and warm season grasses. Now the cool season grasses we often refer to as C3 grasses. And just as the name implies, they grow during the cooler part of the growing season. Typically in the spring is when they put on the bulk of their growth. Oftentimes close to 90% of what they're going to produce during the year will be put on, anywhere from starting in mid-March, and they'll kind of complete their life cycle by late June, early July. And then if we have some fall moisture, they might put on a little bit of fall growth. So because they don't do well in the high temperatures, they suffer from what we call the summer slump. If we have moisture during the mid part of the summer, they might stay green. There might be a little bit of regrowth on them at that time period, but not a lot until those temperatures start to cool off back into those kind of optimum ranges listed up there. We use a lot of these cool season grasses for pasture because they do start growth earlier in the spring and grow longer into that fall time period. But again, the trouble with them is they kind of shut down, and especially under dryland pasture situations during that summer time period. These also are not as water use efficient, so the pounds of water it takes per pound of dry matter tends to be higher than the warm season grasses. So they tend to be less drought tolerant, but they tend to grow during that time period when we will have better soil moisture, which is typically that spring time period. On the plus side, they do have higher forage quality. They're going to be higher in protein, higher in the sugars and the carbohydrates, lower in that fiber component that's less digestible, and tend to be a lot more palatable. Animals just like these a lot better. They're a lot like us, where they like the things that have that higher sugar content. We have the warm season grasses, also referred to as the C4, and that C3 and C4 refer to the first product of photosynthesis is either a 3-carbon chain molecule or a 4-carbon chain molecule. Again, in the warm seasons, they do a lot better under those higher temperatures in the middle part of the summer. They really like it up around that 90+ degree mark. So they're going to grow best in that June, July, August time period. So these might not even start to green up until 4 or 5 weeks later than the cool season grasses. So we sometimes use these for pasture to offset that summer slump of those C3 cool season grasses, because they'll produce during that time period when those C3s just start kind of setting there. Now, if we're in an irrigated higher moisture situation, I typically don't recommend mixing cool and warm season grasses together. But for dryland pasture, it's often good to mix those two together. So you kind of have a bigger opportunity to have a more even production over the whole summer time period. So these advantages to these are they're more water use efficient, so it takes less water per pound of dry matter produced. They tend to be a lot more drought tolerant, but you give up some forage quality. They're going to be lower in protein, lower in those sugars or carbohydrates, higher in that fiber fraction that's not as digestible, and animals just don't tend to like them as well, especially as they get a little more mature. All right, so that's just a really kind of brief introduction to some kind of terms and things that we need to understand to be able to talk about some of these grasses and pasture management. So what is grazing management? It can be defined a number of different ways, but basically it's just a process whereby we have some grazing animals out there. We're going to manipulate them to accomplish some kind of a desired result or goal that we might have. And there's a lot of different goals that you might have. It might be as simple as, a cheap source of feed for your animals. You may be into, you bought this property and you just want to see some animals out there grazing on some nice green pasture, kind of that aesthetics issue. You might be interested in weed control. We often use goats and sheep a lot for weed control on some of our pasture situations. You may have bought a piece of property that's been vacant for a period of time, hasn't had any upkeep or anything done to it. So you want to improve the soil health, you want to improve the vigor of the plants out there. And then we always like to see, nice vegetative cover so we can reduce, soil erosion, minimize any kind of water quality issues from eroding soils and those kinds of things. But regardless of whatever your goal might be, your short or intermediate term goal might be, your long-term goal, hopefully, is the sustained use, the sustainability of your pasture or grassland resource. So what are the two factors that we are continually manipulating out there to achieve this sustainable grazing management that I just mentioned? So we're continually manipulating animals and the plants. Those are the two things that we have out there. And I always like to impart to people that if you have pasture, you're really a grass farmer. And a lot of people pay a lot of attention to the animals and they know a lot about the animals, but they don't know a whole lot about the pasture itself and the grasses that are growing out there. You really need to understand what plants you have out there and how they respond to grazing, what the animals like, and those kinds of things to be able to manage it properly. So in reality, grazing is an ecological process where those plants are going to capture energy from the sun through photosynthesis. It's going to store some of that, and then that's going to be consumed by our primary consumers, which is our livestock. And so basically that's where the animals are going to acquire a lot of their energy and a lot of their nutrients that they need for growth and maintenance. So it's a big balancing act. When you think about grazing management, it's a big balancing act. You're balancing that forage supply, what's growing in your pasture, with the animal demand. Now, if you've got 2 horses or 5 sheep or whatever you might have, that demand is fairly constant. It changes some over the year, but it's fairly constant. When we get into a year like this year, that forage supply side of the equation changes drastically. We may have had some pasture a little bit early, but it didn't grow a whole lot, got dry, things have already browned off, they're not growing anymore, not getting any more regrowth. So we're really down on that forage supply, but that demand side of the equation is still there. So this is where, you might have to bring them in, feed them some supplements, feed them some hay, those kinds of things to preserve your pasture. So these are some things to think about as far as things that affect plant production. I already mentioned, moisture. We're in basically some type of a drought here in this part of the state. So the amount of moisture, drought conditions, temperature can be another big factor. We've had hot temperatures for an extended period of time this summer. Also, cool temperatures can shut plants down as well. Your soil conditions. If you have much acreage at all, you probably will notice that, there's different grasses that grow in different parts of the pasture. There's different productivity in different parts of the pasture. The low areas that catch a little more water, have a little better soil, are going to produce a little more. Those knobs that are kind of rocky and shallow soils are not going to produce near as much. What season of the year we're in, the spring, fall versus that mid part of that summertime period, all of these things can affect how those plants grow and respond out there. Past and current management, extremely important. And we'll talk a lot about this management of the residual. Okay, that's extremely important to maintain those carbohydrate stores for that plant. So when it does have the soil moisture, it can grow readily. And then the forage species present. I'm sure some of you probably have native rangeland, native pastures, and a lot of you are going to have some type of a seeded pasture. Again, smooth brome is going to be one of the big ones along the front range here, but there's a lot of other types of grasses too, crested wheatgrass and Russian wild rye and intermediate wheatgrass, and some of those that might be seeded in the pastures as well. And then the last one there we'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes is pests, and that can be a number of different things that affect your plant production, insects, wildlife, a lot of different things that can eat your forage as well as your animals. Then we look at that intake side of things. one of the big ones is, what kind of animal do you have out there? You know, is it a cow? Is it a horse? Is it a sheep, a goat, chicken, whatever it might be that's eating on that forage? You know, and even when you talk about a cow, is it a, you know, a 900 pound cow, or is it a 1,400 pound cow? Is it a 900 pound horse or a 1,200 pound horse? Okay, the bigger the animal is, the greater the intake has to be. Production level. You know, you might have some steers out there you're trying to put some weight on. You know, is that steer gaining 1 pound a day, or is it gaining 2 pounds a day? One that's gaining 2 pounds is going to need more forage. Stage of reproduction is a huge one. Any animal, doesn't matter what animal it is, if it's in lactation, its requirements for the quality of the forage and the amount of forage goes up. Forage quality is another big one. If, you know, the higher the quality, the faster it digests, the more the animals are going to eat. Water availability, it's been shown that, you know, as long as they have good clean water, the animals are going to eat more. Supplements are another big one. You know, especially right now, we've got grasses that have browned off. You might have some growth out there that you can still graze. The protein level may or may not be adequate. Energy typically is pretty good in those grasses that have browned off, but sometimes the protein's not. So if you give them a little protein supplement, again, they're going to digest that forage quicker and eat more of it. And then environmental stresses can go both ways. You know, if it's hot out, they'll shade up and not eat as much. It gets colder, they need to have higher intakes to maintain warmth and those types of things. So all of these factors can affect how much your animal is eating out there. So I just wanted to throw this slide in just to give you some things to think about. You know, I'm sure that we have a wide range of how much acreage each individual owns. If you own less than an acre, it's probably not very realistic to have horses, cows, lots of different types of livestock, maybe some of the smaller things like chickens, rabbits, maybe a goat or a sheep or two, but it's just not going to, your forage production potential is not very high, especially under dry land. Even if you have irrigation water, 1 acre is not going to produce a whole lot of forage for very many animals. If you have something around 5 acres, you can most likely accommodate a horse or two, maybe some sheep and goats, but you're still going to have to provide some supplemental feed, shelter, but probably a dry lot to have them pen them in periodically. They just can't be out there grazing 24/7. There's not enough forage produced. Then when you start getting up, you know, 10 plus acres, 10, 20, 30 acres or so, that's when you can really start to have some of these larger animals, several horses, maybe a few cows. It starts to become easier to divide the area up for rotational grazing into several smaller pastures or paddocks, those types of things. But I would even go as far as to say that if I had 5 acres, I would probably divide that up into 5 1-acre paddocks if at all possible. You know, even these smaller parcels can benefit from rotational grazing, moving those animals around, letting that grass have some time to rest and recuperate. So again, when we think about allocating the forage out there, so everything that grows above the soil surface is not available for your animals, although we see a lot of pastures that look that way, okay? They're just almost grubbed to the ground. But in reality, again, there's lots of other grazers in the system. You go outside of town here, you're going to get some antelope. You may have deer. You're almost always going to have rodents, insects, a number of different things that are competing for that forage that's produced out there. I found one study here where they looked at grasshopper intake out on rangeland, and they found that if there was 1 grasshopper per square meter, again, that would be a little less than 5,000 grasshoppers per acre. They would remove about 23 pounds per acre of forage if they lived for 75 days and ate on that forage. Now, when we have grasshopper outbreaks, there's generally more than 1 grasshopper per square meter or per square yard. Generally hundreds of grasshoppers per square meter. Okay, so again, they can consume a tremendous amount of forage. It's been estimated sometimes upwards of 20% out on kind of this native rangeland type pasture. So again, can have a major impact on what's available out there. Another one is trampling, just the action of the hooves out there. And that's a big factor right now as these grasses have dried off and they become brown and crispy, animals just walking across the pasture, they're going to break a lot of that off because it's so brittle right now. There's also the issue of fouling by the dung and urine of the animals. Most animals don't want to eat forage next to their own dung and urine spots. Now, sometimes animals are different species, so if you have a pile of horse dung and you have cows out there, the cows might eat close to that, but typically the animals don't eat close to their own dung or urine. And that's partially to help, kind of a built-in mechanism, so they don't pass parasites on within their own species. So one thing you can think about, especially in these small acreages, it's very easy to do, is to periodically harrow your pasture to break up these manure pats or manure piles. It's going to speed the decomposition, speed the nutrient cycling, spread that out. When you spread that out, the manure out and break it open, it exposes it to the sunlight, UV rays, and that helps kill a lot of the parasites and reduce the parasite problem. And hopefully you end up with a lot more uniform grazing. You don't end up with these patches out there, these clumps around the manure pile where the animals won't eat the forage. It's nice, lush, and green, but they oftentimes won't eat it. Then the last one, again, can be a big issue on rangeland, dryland pastures. And again, it's a big issue this year when we have plant maturation and leaf death. Again, that's happened in most of the pastures right now. Those become very brittle, and even without the trampling effects out there, those leaves are just going to break off in the wind and those types of things, and so blows away, lands on the soil surface. It's not available for the animals to intake. So when we think about the forage that's produced out there, there's only, a lot of times, a very small percentage of the total do we consider allocating back to the animal. We need to leave a certain percentage for plant vigor, plant growth, to store those carbohydrates. And we'll talk a little bit more about the take half, leave half principle here in a little bit. But typically we want to leave close to 50% of what's produced out there for the plant vigor, to maintain that plant over time. Then we have to think about those other losses, sometimes upwards of 25% to the wildlife, to the trampling, leaf maturation, death, those types of things. So only maybe about 25% does the animal actually consume, okay? And that's to maintain that pasture in a sustainable manner over time, okay? So, and then it can vary as we go from continuous grazing, where we just put the animals out in a big pasture, to where we go to a simple rotation and maybe break that pasture up into 3, 4, 5 smaller units, to something maybe more intensive, where you may have a dozen units or something out there like that. But if you think about it, a lot of these pastures, they may, in a lot of years, produce around 1,000 pounds of forage per acre. Again, that's from the soil surface up. So if you can take 30% of that, only 300 pounds per acre do you allocate to your animal. The rest of it's going to disappear at some point in time. You need to leave some for that plant vigor, those types of things. So again, this is to maintain that pasture and make it sustainable over time. Here's just an example. Again, just taking the short grass prairie out here that's dominated by blue grama and buffalo grass. Say if you have 10 acres of that, and maybe a kind of a normal to a good year, rainfall year, it might produce around 1,200 pounds per acre. So if we leave 50% of that for the plant, that leaves in 600 pounds per acre. 25% to other losses, about 300 pounds, and then that other 25% is available for your livestock. So 10 acres times that 300 pounds, that's about 3,000 pounds, or 1.5 tons of forage available for grazing. So if you have a couple of horses, mature horses, about 1,250 pounds, and they're going to consume, let's assume, 2% of their body weight, that's about 25 pounds per day per horse, 50 pounds a day total. That would get you about 2 months worth of grazing out there. Again, that's if they're not being fed any other hay or any other types of supplements. They're just out there 24/7 grazing. I stole this from an extension agent down in Douglas County, put this together a number of years ago. But again, kind of looking at these dryland pastures in eastern Colorado here. And in reality, if you have 30 acres and that your horse is out there 24/7, 365 days of the year, it's going to take that 30 acres to produce enough forage to sustain that animal without, again, any type of supplements. Again, you can start to bring in hay and other grains and things and extend that out, or have more animals, those types of things. This is just kind of a good chart to look at, kind of gives you at least a rough idea of, if you have X amount of horses and X amount of ground here in eastern Colorado, can I have them out there 24 hours a day, or am I going to have to do some type of a limited grazing approach, again, if I want to graze for a longer period of time? So here's another way to kind of look at that. If you have limited forage availability, limited amount of acreage available, you can think about hours per day. How many hours per day can I let my horses out? So horses are going to typically eat between 2.5 and 3.5 pounds per hour per horse. And they typically graze, again, if they're out 24 hours a day, somewhere between 9 and 14 hours a day. So again, we take that same example, 3,000 pounds of total forage available on that 10 acres. How many days can we graze those 2 mature horses if we're limited to 4 hours per day? So we're going to take something in the middle there, 3 pounds per hour times our 2 horses, 4 hours a day. So that calculates out to about 125 days of total grazing, or 4.2 months. Now, again, you might wonder why, 4 hours a day, why doesn't it more months? But again, the animals are only going to eat, somewhere 9 to 14 hours a day. And the other thing that we found, recent research has found, is when we go to limiting horses on their, to hours a day in a pasture for grazing, they will actually compensate and consume at a higher rate than if they were out there 24/7. Okay. So that's something you have to kind of consider too. They learn quickly, and that when they're out on pasture, that if they want to eat pasture, eat that grass, so they're going to fill up at more quickly than they would normally if they were out there 24 hours a day. Okay, so I want to bring in this concept of overgrazing, and it's simply defined as the process of repeated selective use of the best, most palatable plants in a pasture. And those palatable plants, we sometimes refer to them as decreasers, because they're going to be grazed. If they're repeatedly grazed, their vigor's on a decline. They're not going to store those carbohydrates, and they're going to decline out of the composition and disappear. And a lot of times I like to refer to these as the ice cream plants. Again, animals are no different than we are. If we go into a buffet restaurant, are we going to run to that broccoli vegetables or the mixed vegetable platter? No, we're probably going to go to the steak or the hamburgers or the pizza or the chocolate cake or the ice cream or something like that, what we really like, okay? Animals are no different, okay? They're going to eat what they like first, and what they don't like a little bit later. So the question here is, overgrazing always related to too many animals? So hopefully you say no. It's related to the number of animals and the time the animals are on pasture, okay? And I like to use these photos here in class, and I always point to that one down there in the left-hand corner, and I say, is this overgrazed? And most people will say, yes, it's overgrazed. Well, maybe, maybe not, okay? Depends on how that pasture is used. This is a calving pasture that's used in the springtime. Animals may only be on there for 30 to 45 days during calving season, and then they're gone for the rest of the season. There's no more grazing on that pasture. Okay, so it has the whole rest of the summer to recuperate, photosynthesize, produce those carbohydrates, go to seed, restore all of its carbohydrate reserves. So in that case, it's heavily grazed at this point in time, but I wouldn't say that it's overgrazed, okay? But if this looked like this at the end of the summer, yes, it would be overgrazed. So to throw this up too, if you have 2 pastures of equal size, which scenario will lead to overgrazing? 1 animal in that pasture for 100 days, or 100 animals for 1 day? And the answer is that 1 animal for 100 days, because what happens? Basically, it's going to lead to overgraze, patches that are overgrazed, and others that are underutilized or not utilized at all. Because the animal goes around and picks those ice cream plants, those decreaser type plants, what it really likes, it's going to graze those. And then in 7 to 10 to 14 days, when those regrow, that nice leafy regrowth is going to be high quality, high in sugars, high in protein, and they're going to come back and they're going to regraze that again. And that will continue to happen as long as that plant continues to grow and regrow through this the growing season there. So you end up with parts of the pasture that the animal doesn't even touch at all, and parts that are going to be just grubbed to the ground, and that's where you're going to start to lose plants. If you have just 100 animals for one day, they're going to come in there, they're going to be a lot less selective, they're going to graze it down, but then it has this rest period to recuperate and replenish. So the effect on the pastures is going to be much different, okay? So when we talk about grazing and grazing systems, there's a lot of different systems out there, different ways to do it. The big thing is to be flexible, but I try to steer people away from this continuous grazing or continuous stocking where you just have one big pasture and you put your animals out there in that one big pasture and you just let them graze. If you can divide that up anyway into smaller units, smaller subdivisions, even if you just divide it in two, it's often better so that at least half of that pasture can be resting while the other half is being grazed. And again, your small acreage pastures are no different than your large, maybe 1,000, 10,000 acre pastures that a lot of producers work with out here in eastern Colorado. So there are some advantages to continuous grazing. It's easy. You just have to have a perimeter fence. You put the animals out there. You don't have to have a lot of inputs. Typically have one water source, one water point. The animals can be very selective, so they do very well. But again, they're going to repeatedly come back to some of those plants. They're going to overgraze those, and eventually those are going to disappear. Your yields are going to go down. You're going to start to see more bare ground and weeds coming in, those types of things. When you look at your rotational grazing, again, requires more management, more time, more infrastructure. Fencing and water are the big ones. Fencing is fairly easy with the use of electric fence and poly wire, movable wires, and those types of things. The water is many times the big limiting factor there. But you'll tend to have higher forage yields, more vigorous plants. You concentrate animals, you take away some of that selectivity, so all the plants get grazed out there, so you don't favor one over the other. Tend to have fewer weed issues because the plants are more vigorous and keep those weeds out of there, those types of things. So this whole idea of, how many subdivisions or paddocks, how much division do I need out there? So this is a chart out of one of my range books that I like to use, where they've taken, this is a 1,000-acre pasture, and they've divided it into 4, 8, 12, or 16 smaller units or paddocks. And then I'd like to look at that column over there on the right there, which is what percent of the season is a given pasture ungrazed. So if you look at the 4 pasture divisions, about 75% of the time, a pasture has no animals in it. So adding 4 more units up to 8, it's a pretty big jump. You go from 75 to 88% of the time. But then you start to see this diminishing returns, okay? So when we go from 12 to 16 paddocks or pastures, we only get a 2 percentage point increase in that percent of the season that the pasture is ungrazed. And this rest period is really what's important and key to making these rotational systems work. So, especially in dry land, I always tell people, that 2 divisions is better than 1, 3 is better than 2, and 4 is better than 3, and so on. But if you kind of start to think about it and kind of do the math here, we don't typically want to be out there, our grazing periods any longer than about 7 to 10 days in a given subdivision. Okay, so if we have 8 subdivisions there, that means that 7 pastures are going to be rested at any point in time. So 7 times 7 means a pasture or paddock is going to be rested for 49 days. So that's a fairly long period of time, often is needed in dry land pasture management. So 8 is a good number. I like to if at all possible, have between 5 and 8 subdivisions. Okay. Now, if you think about 5, okay, and if you go with a 10-day grazing period, so 4 pastures are being rested, 4 times 10, so that's a 40-day rest period. Again, that's a pretty decent rest period. Okay, so it doesn't take a whole lot of subdivision. So that's what I said, if I had a 5-acre small acreage and I could divide that into 5 1-acre paddocks and rotate among them, that would be an excellent example. So when you think about just, your pasture and your your grass requirements out there, we need that green leaf area. Again, that's where your sunlight capture is going to come from. That's what's going to produce those carbohydrates and fill those energy reserves. That's going to support growth and regrowth over the season, through the winter, that new growth that occurs in that springtime period. So in our grasses, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that a lot of those energy reserves are stored in that stubble or that residual, those lower stem bases. So we need to maintain about 3 to 4 inches of stubble at all times. I got through the winter here for survival and spring growth, which is extremely important, but also at all times through the year, basically. Okay, we want to try not to graze lower than about that 3 to 4 inches. Okay, and that's on average. And the other thing to think about is that photosynthesis that's going on in that green leaf area is producing the energy that goes into the roots. And especially in a dryland situation, the roots are extremely important because that's where your water and your nutrients come from. And the deeper and more extensive that root system is, the better those plants are going to be able to survive. Again, roots are extremely important. What you see above ground is typically reflected in what's going on below ground. So there's going to be as many pounds of roots per acre or more as there is above ground production. Okay. So again, that above ground production, that biomass is going to support the root system and that food storage reserves of those carbohydrates. And then that below ground, again, supports the water and the nutrients that supports that leaf area. Okay. So really, I like to think of your root system as your savings account. It's your money in the bank. Now, you go out in eastern Colorado, we have a lot of good livestock producers, range managers out there. And the ones that do it right and leave some residual behind, don't graze at the same place at the same time every year, graze at a moderate level, leave at least 50% of what's produced out there, all of those types of things. We get into these drought situations like we're in now, when other guys are selling cows and feeding hay, they kind of look around and say, what drought? Okay. Because they've taken care of their grasses are now taking care of them and their livestock. Okay. So again, a lot of that is to do to this big extensive root system that they've developed over time. Now I mentioned, leaving 50% of what's produced out there. And this kind of comes back to some old research that was done, I think, clear back in the 50s. So it's, 70 years old or so. You can tell by the photos here, these black and white photos. But what they did is they grew a bunch of different grasses in some pots in a greenhouse. And then they came in and would remove, say, 10% of the leaf matter, 20%, on up to 90%. And then they periodically pulled plants out of the pots and washed out that root system and looked at what was happening to the roots. Were they still growing, putting on new root growth, or had root growth stopped? Those types of things. So what they found is until you got up to about, or when you got up to about that 50% removal of that above ground growth, that's when we started to have an impact on below ground root growth. Okay. And so again, it doesn't take much above that 50%. Once we get to 60, we've impacted about 50% of that root system, that root growth. So again, this is where that take half, leave half comes in. And it's just a good general rule of thumb to go by. And again, that doesn't mean you can graze 50% of it and leave 50% of it, because we have to take into account those other grazers, those other losses in the system. Okay. So here's just kind of some general and again, they're general. We have to be flexible in everything we do. You know, we have to adapt to years like this year when we don't have very much production out there. Everything's dried up. But for most species, most grass species, we're going to initiate grazing when the plants are about 6 to 10 inches tall, somewhere in that area there. Again, this is going to be species dependent, but it's going to hold for most of the grasses that we deal with. We want to limit grazing in a paddock to no more than 7 to 10 days, especially when the plants are actively growing during that spring time period when we have soil moisture. Right now, it doesn't matter because we don't have really any growth going on out there, or very little growth going on out there. The big one is the third point here, is where we want to terminate grazing when the stubble is in that 3 to 4 inches tall. And again, that's going to be the pasture average. Some plants are going to be taller, some are going to be shorter. I wish I could find that cow or that horse that would graze to a 4-inch stubble height. But again, the plants they really like, they may take it down to 2 inches. Some plants may be 6 inches, some may be 8, some 4, some 3. You know, we're just looking at the average. So what we want to see, a well-managed, well-grazed pasture, most plants are going to be defoliated at least once or one time. That's our goal, is having defoliated one time. Again, you want to see some roughness to that pasture. You know, again, thinking about, you know, some plants being 8 inches, some 6, some 4, some 2. You want to see some roughness to that pasture. You don't want to see it look like a pool table, okay? Like you took the mower out there and mowed it all to the same height, okay? So again, we're working on averages. So again, the other thing to pay close attention to is those key species, those ice cream plants, those decreasers, okay? Because those are the ones we want to protect. They're the most palatable, typically they're most nutritious, and if they're not eating some of those other plants, then, you know, it doesn't really matter. You know, you want to make sure you maintain those ice cream plants. So if they're getting grazed down pretty tight, again, it's time to move them on to the next pasture. Especially during that main growing season, we want to allow at least 28 to 30 days, about 4 weeks of regrowth. And oftentimes, again, under dryland, for dryland pastures, depends on the year and the moisture, we may be in that 40 to 60 plus days. And if we're in a situation right now and we've grazed a pasture or a paddock and we're down to that 3 to 4 inch average stubble height, and don't have any soil moisture, we're not getting any regrowth, then those animals should be pulled, put in a dry lot, fed hay, moved to another pasture that does have maybe some stockpiled forage in it that they can graze on. But don't just leave the animals out there and continue to graze. It will do more harm in the long run than good. So I said it's species dependent, that you know, when you start grazing, and especially that 3 to 4 inch stubble, especially on our native rangeland out here in eastern Colorado, we have a couple of short grasses, one called blue grama and the other one called buffalo grass. And these will often dominate a lot of the range sites out here in eastern Colorado. Again, they're short grasses. They may not get some years 2 to 4 inches tall. Okay, so they don't even reach that 4-inch minimum stubble height. But does that mean you shouldn't graze those grasses or graze in those pastures that have those grasses? No. You can graze in those because those two species are very grazing tolerant. They evolved under buffalo grazing, bison grazing, and so they're very grazing tolerant. A lot of times they don't even raise up that growing point that I talked about at all. Okay, they don't put on a stem, they don't put on a seed head. And so that growing point is below the soil surface. All they're doing is producing some leaf, and again, it's typically all right to graze some of that leaf. Animals can only graze so short. It depends on the animal. Can only graze so short anyway. So again, that 4-inch stubble height may not hold for grasses like this blue grama and buffalo grass. This is what we don't want to see. You know, you don't want your pasture to look like. If you've got, you know, some of the taller grasses that get, you know, that 6, 8, 10, 12 inches tall, we don't want it to look like this particular paddock right here. Like you took the mower out there, set it about as low to the ground as you can get it, and you mowed it. It's all the same height. You know, this one we can start to see some weeds starting to encroach here along the fence line. You know, this gets too bad, we get a big old windstorm, it may pick up some soil, might get some blowing soil, those types of things. So we just don't like to really see at least that big of an area anyway, graze that tightly. So this is where, that sacrifice area, the exercise area, the dry lot, the corral, the unvegetated area, whatever you want to call it, comes into play. To me, any small acreage landowner that has livestock needs to have some type of a dry lot type area. It's almost impossible to continuously graze, especially beyond kind of this spring into midsummer time period. Even in good years, the grasses a lot of times will shut down and not get a whole lot of regrowth on them. But again, these can be used during periods of wet soil conditions. Especially if you're on a heavier clay soil and you get 1.5 inches of rain, you may not want to have the animals out there. You may want to pull them into a dry lot area and feed them hay for a few days until it dries back off, because you don't want a lot of hoof prints and pugging and that stuff going on out there. Again, drought, slow forage growth during the middle of summer, the dormant season during that winter time period are all good things to keep in mind when you're going to pull these animals off of that pasture. Again, stressing that even during the winter, when I was in school, we were taught that the carbohydrates were stored in the roots and not those crowns or stem bases, and it was all right in the wintertime. The plants were dormant. You can just graze them as tight as you could graze them. But we've learned now that that's not a good thing. We want to maintain that 3 to 4 inch stubble during that winter time period. Here's just an example of a pasture layout showing 6 different paddocks, and again that dry lot or holding pen there. Again, depends on your particular layout of your property and how you might be able to fit something like this in. Horses are notorious spot grazers, so again, watch what plants they're eating and rotate them before you, when you reach that minimum, that 3 to 4 inch height, again, on those ice cream or those desirable plants that they're eating on. And again, if you get into these situations, like in that picture there where they've grazed things down pretty tight, you rotate them on, you might want to bring something like a mower in, mow that down about 4 inches, kind of evens things out, stimulates new growth, improves your forage quality, discourages future spot grazing when they come back in, those types of things. I wanted to just talk a few minutes about weed control. Your best defense against weeds is a vigorous, well-managed stand of grass. Again, not taking it down too tight. Use rotational grazing, maintain that minimum stubble height, practice that take half, leave half principle. We'll talk a little bit about interseeding here in a few minutes. If you don't have a very big infestation of weeds, hand pulling a lot of times works pretty well. Hoeing them out can be effective. But some of our weeds have those deep spreading rhizomes that I talked about, Canada thistle and leafy spurge and some of those. So it's very difficult to just pull or hoe those out. Herbicides a lot of times are needed for those. Mowing on your annual weeds, 4 to 6 inches tall. Don't get down into the grasses. Take too much of the grass off, but you just mow those tops off of those weeds, keep them from going to seed, because again, the annuals come up from seed every year. Then on some of these weeds, there are some biological controls, some insects and things we can use to help control those. There's a noxious weed law, and it's mandated by the state that you control certain weeds on your property, and there's a website listed there that gives you the list. There's an A, B, and C list, and then each county is going to have their own weed management plan that kind of works off of that list, that A, B, and C list. So Larimer County has their own. But again, when we talk about a lot of these perennial noxious weeds like Canada thistle and leafy spurge and some of those, about the only way to really control those is with some type of a herbicide. Now, I don't like using herbicides, but there's just situations where that's about your only choice. Now, the thing to think about is some of the herbicides are restricted use, so they're going to require some type of a private pesticide applicator license to purchase and apply. Other ones are general use. Big thing is read the label, and then pay attention to rates, timing of application, what weeds are controlled, And again, if you're in a grazing or haying situation, you know, a lot of these will have grazing or haying restrictions. You may not be able to graze for a certain amount of time, or you may not be able to feed hay off of that particular field to your animals, those kinds of things. And then one last comment here is that, you know, some of these herbicides can take, you know, you might have a plant that can be toxic to the animal, but it's not palatable. So you don't really have to worry about it. But if you spray it with a herbicide, a lot of times it changes the sugar content in those plants. And you can take something that's unpalatable and make it palatable. So it's always a good idea after you've sprayed for weeds that you remove the animals from the pasture, even if there's no grazing restrictions, until those plants have died back. But even sometimes when the plants are dead and dry, if the animals eat them, they can still be toxic. They're less likely to eat a dry, dead plant that's just not as palatable. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about specific herbicides, but I wanted to bring one to your attention. There is a new herbicide just on the horizon here for cheatgrass control. And a lot of you have issues with cheatgrass. Almost everybody has it, at least to some degree. Here's just a field out north of the Nunn Road, and mostly smooth brome grass here, and you've got a pipeline going across there, and it's just been infested with cheatgrass. There's a new herbicide, it's called Rejuvra, just been recently approved by the EPA for use on range and pasture. There is another herbicide called Esplanade that's for non-cropland use, like along roadsides and different places, but it has the same active ingredient in it. It's been tested, and it's just going through state approvals right now, so it should be out pretty shortly. But excellent control on many of your annual grasses like cheatgrass. Now, this is a pre-emergent herbicide, so unlike Roundup, where you spray it on a green plant and it kills the plant, this prevents the germination of the seed, and that's the big issue with cheatgrass. It's an annual grass, and it produces hundreds of thousands of seeds, and it's just hard to ever get rid of that seed bank. And so some of the research has shown that there can be residual control from one up to 4 years after application. And this is going to be an expensive herbicide. If the Esplanade right now is selling for $400 a quart, but the saving grace on this is they only need about 2.5 to 3 ounces per acre. So, a quart will spray about 10 acres of area. So just something to keep on the radar. Hopefully this is like the Larimer County Weed District will carry that once it's available. Now, I said biological controls. A lot of times when we think of biological, we think of insects, but animals can also be a biological control. And so here, this is on CSU's property just kind of west of Waverly, north of town. And I was walking out across there, and most of it's brown and dried off just like everybody else's pasture. And I came across this patch of field bindweed. It's the only green thing in the pasture. We put some animals in there. What do you think they're going to eat first? They're probably going to go and eat that field bindweed. Now, in reality, a lot of these weed species that we deal with can actually be fairly decent forage and provide nutrition to our animals. So this is just a Kathy Voth, who's done a lot of grazing work and teaching animals to eat weeds, has done and gone and measured the forage quality, the protein and the fiber content of a lot of these different weeds out there. Say the bindweed right there, 16% protein. That'll rival just good old quality alfalfa. And again, it's low in fiber, high in protein, and it tends to be pretty palatable. So a lot of these weeds that we deal with, have a good nutritional quality to them. The thing you want to be careful with is that some weeds can also have toxicity issues or poisoning issues. All plants have toxins, but some of them have high enough concentrations that it can cause sickness and possible death in your animals. A lot of that depends on the type of livestock. Goats and sheep tend to be a lot more tolerant to a lot of these toxins than cattle and horses and some of the other ones. Depends on the amount that's consumed, the rate of consumption, and the availability and intake of other forages. If they have other things that they're eating at the same time, it kind of dilutes those out. So I found a really good resource from Utah State where they looked at a lot of the research and put this fact sheet together on the nutritional value and toxins in various noxious weeds. So if you're concerned about toxins, this is a place to go and it will talk about a lot of those weed species and if they have any potential toxins and to what specific animal species they're toxic to. All right, fertilization. I want to just touch on that a minute. Is it a good idea? That depends. It can be done, but it's risky, again, since water is your most limiting factor, okay? It can be more limiting than nutrients generally. But if you apply nutrients, generally nitrogen and phosphorus are the only nutrients of concern on pasture. We really need to get a soil test to determine if phosphorus is limiting. If you apply any nitrogen, keep the rate low, no more than about 30 to 40 pounds of N per acre. You can apply it in the fall, but spring is probably a better time. You can kind of see what the moisture has done over the winter time period, what the spring outlook is. So anytime from about mid-March through that early April time period would be a good time to apply it. But you want to try to time it just prior to some type of precipitation, a good wet snow or a rain event to move that fertilizer, that nutrients into the soil where the plants can uptake them. But again, it can depend on if you don't get enough water, it's not going to respond to that added nitrogen, so you might have wasted your money. So it works really good on some of our cool season pastures like smooth brome and crested wheatgrass and some of those, but not so well on native rangeland if you have native rangeland. All right, why do I have so much bare ground between plants? Isn't there something I can do about it? I seed to help fill in the gaps. Generally, the answer is no on dry land. Okay? There's only so much water under dry land, so plants naturally space themselves. You're always going to see bare ground and dry land pastures along the Front Range. Okay? This is an example of smooth brome. Again, one of those rhizomatous grasses. Spreads by those underground rhizome systems, how it just spaces itself out based on how much water is available. Okay, if there was more water available, you would see the tillers a lot closer together, more of a nice tight sod. So, can my pasture be improved by interseeding, which consists of just seeding into the existing vegetation without tilling the soil first? And as I said, with fertilization, there's a high risk of failure due to lack or erratic timing of precipitation. And that timing or erratic timing of precipitation is our biggest factor, because you put the seed in the ground, you need moist soil until the plants germinate. And once they germinate, it has to stay moist enough, long enough for those plants to establish roots down deep into the soil profile. And often that doesn't happen. And so often, if you're trying to interseed into the existing plants, you're going to have to do that multiple times in order to get some plants to establish. And it's pretty risky. But if you decide to try to do that, you're going to need a heavy-duty no-till drill to plant that seed into that, because the soil is going to be pretty firm, but you can't plant the seed any deeper than about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. But you need some seed-to-soil contact, some soil coverage over that seed. We typically seed during the dormant season, which would be kind of from mid to late November in this area through about mid-March, anytime that the soil is not frozen, snow cover, or it's too wet. We're just putting the seed in the ground, so it's going to germinate in that spring time period when the soil temperatures warm up. So can I till the pasture and reseed? It can be done, but I generally don't recommend that as a good idea. Again, you're dependent on the timing and amount of precipitation. You plow the soil, turn it over, get rid of all the plants that are there. It's going to expose that soil to wind and water erosion. And anytime you disturb the soil, you're going to stimulate the weed seeds in the ground. And oftentimes you're going to end up with a lot of weeds, very little, if any, grass, and a lot of times a bigger problem than what you started with. Now, the one thing I didn't make a slide on, I wanted to mention is that one thing you can do is, instead of just seeding into the existing vegetation, you can spray that vegetation with something like Roundup to kill the existing vegetation, but not disturb the soil, and then take that heavy-duty no-till drill and seed your new plants or new seed into that. Okay, that will often work. So some grasses, I just wanted to mention a few grasses that work under dry land in this area. Smooth brome, of course, the intermediate pubescent wheatgrass. Pubescent wheatgrass actually tends to be a little more drought tolerant, especially the Luna variety of that. Crested wheatgrass is one of the most drought tolerant grasses we have out there, but it's going to dry up in the middle part of the summer, even when we have good moisture. Western wheatgrass is a native one. Thick spike and stream bank wheatgrass work fairly well in some situations, especially a little bit more sandy type soils. Russian wild rye is almost as drought tolerant as the crested wheatgrass. And then green needlegrass is another native species, cool season grass that works fairly well in this area. But a lot of your wheatgrasses have pretty good drought tolerance, as well as if you have salty soils, alkaline type soils, also have some alkaline tolerance as well. One of the issues with smooth brome, I just took this north of town, tends to creep to that rhizome system and invade other areas. So here's a crested wheatgrass pasture. I'm standing on the road, and the roadside was reseeded with smooth brome, and we see smooth brome creeping out into that pasture from the roadside. So that's why a lot of people don't like smooth brome. It can be sometimes a little invasive, but if you look out there, which would you rather have, the crested wheatgrass or the smooth brome? Smooth brome still has a little bit of green to it. It looks like it's a little more productive than that crested wheatgrass. Here's the Waverly property at CSU. Again, primarily Russian wild rye you see out there, the kind of light colored, mixed in with a little bit of crested wheatgrass. And then I found this one little patch here of intermediate wheatgrass that was growing out there as well. One nice thing about the intermediate is it has a little bit longer green period than those other grasses. So it still has a little bit of green on it. So if I put animals out there, they're probably going to graze that before they graze that old dried brown crested wheatgrass and Russian wild rye. So cool season grasses, you can also look at some of the warm seasons. And all of these are natives. Things like switchgrass and side oats grama work fairly well. Big blue stem depends on the site. If it's a little better soil, maybe a little bit of a bottom type area, works pretty well. A little blue stem works, is really drought tolerant. Yellow Indian grass would kind of go along with the big blue stem. Sandier soils, things like sand drop seed, the sand blue stem, prairie sandreed work pretty well. And then the blue grama and buffalo grass, both short grasses. I typically don't put buffalo grass in the mix, but I might put a little bit of blue grama because it will respond and produce fairly well. It has really high quality forage if you get a little bit of moisture on it. All right, just finish up here. Since we're in a drought, I thought I'd throw this slide in. You will know the drought is over when, after 3 years, the spider in your rain gauge is moved out. Stock tank gets enough water in it to start leaking again. Then there's a mysterious force that's discoloring your hay meadows, pastures, and rangeland, and it's been identified as new green leaves. Wouldn't we love to see that right now? When managing dryland pastures, again, always be thankful for rain because that's what's going to produce those plants, produce that forage out there for you. There's a few additional resources for you. Karen's going to email out the presentation, I think, in a few days here, so you can have that and have all these different resources available at your fingertips. So with that, we got a few minutes anyway for some questions.
Okay, great. Joe, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciated that. And I'm very grateful that everyone attended. I know there was a lot of information. And like Joe said, I'm going to go ahead and email out the presentation so you've got the resources and you have those things at your fingertips. So hopefully you didn't take too many notes and that you'll get all that information. I'm going to go ahead, if everyone has a question, I'm going to go ahead and read the questions that I have in the chat. Feel free to go ahead and add any questions that you might like Joe to comment on, and we'll go through those. We've got about 10 minutes, so we're going to go ahead through those questions. And again, you'll have my contact information, as you probably most of you already do. So you can always email me questions, and I'll get an answer for you.
Yeah, me too. They can email me as well. So
perfect. Thanks, Joe. And I think your contact was on the first slide, right?
Yep.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you. So Chad asks, we've been keeping our horses off in April, May, and June. Are we hurting or helping our pastures by doing this?
Well, it definitely doesn't hurt anything. That's the prime part of the growing season. That's when we had a little bit of soil moisture. So hopefully you've got a little bit of growth out there. You can go ahead and if you've got some growth, you can go ahead and graze that again, just paying attention to that. Once it gets grazed down to about 3 to 4 inches, again, kind of on average, I'd pull the horses back in, put them in the dry lot.
Great, thank you. Next, just a comment, grazing is similar to mowing, leaving 3 or 4 inches. And so, yeah, and Joe did comment on that. It's not necessarily that it's all mowed to 3 or 4 inches, but definitely paying attention to that grass height. And there will be some grasses that will be significantly longer, but it's very similar, yes.
Yeah, I mean, mowing or haying and those types of things, everything's treated exactly the same. Everything's mowed to the exact same height. Again, we're working on the average, the pasture average. So again, you're going to have some that's a little taller, some that's a little shorter, but again, we don't want it all looking like 2 inches or whatever out there. That's when we get into trouble.
Okay, and Robert asked, are the new cheatgrass herbicides more effective than Plateau? And do they also control alyssum?
I'd have to look on the alyssum. I mean, there's a whole list of different weed species that it controls. Yes, as far as effectiveness, I think it's going to be more effective from what I understand from the research that's been done. Because if we can get, more than 1 year of control, the Plateau is pretty much a 1 year control, and then you have to reapply it again. So if this one, if we can get 2, 3, 4 years of control out of it, yes, it's going to be a much better. And again, if we can keep the cheatgrass from germinating and producing more seed, then should be a good one.
Good. And do you know, Joe, alyssum, this was just a bumper year for alyssum. Any idea of that herbicide being effective on alyssum?
No, I'd have to look that one up.
Okay. All right,
I mean,
great. Thank you.
it's too new. I haven't
Yeah.
studied the list of everything it controls.
Yeah, and those of you that are in Larimer County, if you don't know, Larimer County has a fabulous weed district, and they are always my go-to source when it comes to herbicides because they keep on top of the herbicide that works best for the weed and the time of year to apply it and the amount that is needed. So they're also a really great resource. And those of you who aren't in Larimer County, you might want to check to see if your county has a weed district. And again, they're going to be a real good resource for you.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I mean, their website is great. You can take pictures of a weed, you can post the weed, give some information, and they will try to help you identify that from photos. They have a list of contractors, seed companies, herbicide sprayers, people that do drilling, interseeding of grasses and forages. It's a great resource.
Yep, they are. Jean asks, what type of grass is North Park?
Depends on where you're at in North Park. I mean,
yeah, Jean, I'm not sure if is this a type of grass, or are you asking what type of grass is in North Park? Because this says what type of grass is North Park. And so I don't know if that's a type of grass she's referring to or asking what might be in North Park.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, so Jean, if you want to clarify that in the chat, that would be great. Thanks. Chris asks, just a really great presentation. Thanks, Joe. And then Kurt asks, has made a comment. Thanks so much, Joe. And you for creating and hosting this webinar. And this is a retired professor from CSU. So great, Kurt, I'm glad you could join us. We've emailed quite a bit this past week. Another thank you, great presentation. Jean asks, how soon can you graze a newly seeded pasture? Great question.
Yeah. Sometimes under dryland, we want to let it go a full season, a full growing season before we put any animals out there. And it just depends. That'll generally be enough time, but you want to kind of look at how the grasses are doing. And if they're struggling, make sure they have a well-developed root system. Make sure you can't go out there and grab a hold of them and pull them out of the ground by the roots, those kinds of things. The more time you can give it, the better. Sometimes 2 years is not, or 2 growing seasons is not a bad idea to make sure they're well established. But yeah, you just kind of have to look at them and see how many, how well they're tillering out, those kinds of things. So if you need help, we can always come out and take a look for you too.
Okay, good question from Robert. Can you comment on grazing horses and cattle separately? I have 4 paddocks, for example. Can I graze horses followed by cattle?
Yes, there should be no problem doing that. We do that a lot with different types of animals. You might, let's say, use the cows to kind of be the cleanup, because the horses are a little more, tend to be a little more picky or choosy. So a little more of the spot grazer. So if you put the cows in there after the horses, then they'll often clean up some of the grasses and stuff, forages that the horses have left. Yep. So it's not a bad way to do it. Yep.
Great, thanks. So Kurt asks, we have no animals on about 12 and a half acres of homeowners association land, which is mowed. Would it be better to mow it off 40 to 50% to maintain plant vigor, except for those areas we mow for 3 to 4 inches for defensible space? So basically he's asking, would it be better to mow some of that area to maintain the plant vigor?
Well, if it's being mowed and all mowed to say 4 inches, I wouldn't be concerned about it. Mowing it at a higher height to leave, 50%. So the 4-inch height for mowing, since everything's treated the same, would be all right.
Okay. Ken asks, are there advantages to harrowing other than manure breakup?
Not a lot. Sometimes depends on when you harrow. If you have a lot of old standing dead or something out there, it can break some of that up, get it down on the soil so it decomposes and recycles those nutrients. But anytime you disturb any of the soil, you can stimulate weed seed germination and those kinds of things. Even with a light harrowing, you can do that. So I can't really think of anything else that it would really be advantageous for.
Good. Yeah, I know I always caution people about disturbing the soil because overgrazing, some folks that have purchased a small acreage and it was previously overgrazed, that's what they're seeing. And so what you don't want to do is have a healthy pasture and disturb the soil too much, whether it's grazing or other types of disturbance, and then have that go backwards, because then you're fighting a battle that you just don't even want to fight.
Yeah.
So Travis asks, what is your opinion on spraying for larkspur in a cattle pasture? Depends.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how much larkspur you have. But larkspur is one that you have to be careful with because it's poisonous even when it's dead.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, yeah. But again, once it's dead, and dried up, a lot of times they're not going to, if there's anything else there, they're not going to, it's not very palatable. They're not typically going to chase after it. They will eat it when it's green, for sure. And so it can be pretty toxic, pretty deadly.
Okay, so we're going to circle back to Jean. So she was actually interested in knowing what kind of grass is grown in North Park because she evidently purchases hay from North Park. So I don't know if you're familiar with what's in North Park or not.
Yeah, most of those mountain hay meadows are fairly similar. A lot of what's going to be in the hay is what we call common meadow foxtail, and it's not the bad foxtail. It's actually been seeded in those meadows. That's a big one. There'll be your native sedges and rushes, sometimes red top, sometimes a little timothy. Sometimes the meadow foxtail is confused with timothy because it has a head that looks a lot like timothy, kind of that cylindrical head. And so sometimes people are sold timothy hay that's really meadow foxtail hay. But that'll be the dominant species generally
Okay.
in the hay up there.
Okay, we've got a number of messages, but we're about out of time. I'm just going to add one additional comment here. Allison actually looked up the label for Escalante, and Horiolism is not on the label. I'm not sure. I think I know Rob who asked this question, and he's talking about Yellowism, but I could be wrong. Again, it's common names versus scientific names. But Horiolism, if Rob, that's what you were asking about, it's not on the label for Escalante. So with that, I think we're out of time. So Joe, I want to thank you very much. And I don't know if I can capture some of the comments. I can respond to you. I'm not sure if they'll save or not, or some of the questions, but again, you're always welcome to send me an email if I didn't get to your question. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope it was very valuable for you. And I will send out the presentation, and keep in touch, and we'll hope for some rain soon. So thanks everybody so much.